The sun blazed down on me like a relentless furnace, its heat pressing against my skin as I stood beside my irrigation ditch, staring at the cracked, bone-dry earth where water should have been flowing. My heart thumped in my chest, a frantic rhythm louder than a jackhammer tearing through concrete, because my well, a lifeline, had never failed me before, not even during the harshest droughts that had swept through the region years ago. But now, with my crops wilting into brittle husks and my livestock panting like they'd crossed a desert, the water was vanishing, slipping away like a thief in the dead of night, leaving me with nothing but sweat trickling down my face and a growing knot of dread in my gut. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't nature's doing. Someone was stealing from me, and when I found them, they'd pay a price steeper than they could imagine. It all started a few weeks back when I first noticed the water pressure in my well dipping lower than usual, a subtle shift I chalked up to the summer heat sucking the land dry. But then it got worse. My irrigation system slowed to a pathetic dribble, barely enough to wet the soil, while my cattle gathered around their troughs, their confused moos echoing across the farm like a plea for answers I didn't have. My crops, once proud rows of green stretching toward the sky, now drooped in defeat, their leaves curling inward as if they'd given up hope entirely. I couldn't blame them because I was starting to feel the same way. Desperate, I called in Earl, a grizzled plumber with a permanent scowl, who stomped around my property muttering curses under his breath while I trailed behind him, anxiety gnawing at me with every step he took. Earl spent an hour poking at pipes and squinting at the well, his boots kicking up dust as he worked, until he finally straightened up, scratched his head, and fixed me with a look that made my stomach drop. "Ain't no leak, Jake," he growled, his voice rough as gravel. "You got yourself a thief." I barked out a laugh. Stealing water from a farm seemed absurd, the kind of thing no sane person would attempt. But then the laughter died in my throat, replaced by a cold certainty as a name clicked into place. Karen Whitman, my charming neighbor who'd been a splinter under my nail since the day she rolled into town. She'd spent years griping about my farm. The smell of manure, the ugly barn blocking her view, the rooster crowing at dawn like it was a personal attack on her beauty sleep. Karen was the type to smile through gritted teeth while secretly plotting your downfall. And lately, she'd turned her backyard into a gaudy paradise that screamed money and excess. A sprawling green lawn, a koi pond teeming with fish, and a three-tiered fountain that gushed water like she was living in some ancient empire. It hit me then, standing there with Earl's words ringing in my ears, that her little oasis wasn't some miracle of conservation. It was my water keeping it alive while my farm withered. I didn't have proof yet, but every fiber of me knew she was behind it. And the thought of her sipping iced tea in her floral dresses while my livelihood dried up lit a fire in me I couldn't ignore. She'd messed with the wrong farmer. The next morning I was up before the sun, the sky still a bruised purple as I pulled on my boots and grabbed a flashlight, determined to follow the trail of my vanishing water. I traced the main water line from my well, crawling through prickly bushes, hauling myself over rickety fences, and skirting past the shadowed bulk of my barn, my breath hitching as I spotted something odd. A patch of ground where the dirt looked freshly disturbed. My jaw tightened as I knelt down, running my fingers over the soil until I found it. A section of my underground pipe had been sliced open and patched with a new PVC line, snaking off like a guilty secret toward the property line, straight into Karen's backyard. I followed it, my pulse pounding in my ears until I reached her land, where the pipe disappeared beneath a layer of mulch and decorative rocks, feeding her ridiculous fountain and pond like a hidden vein of stolen life. I stood there, hands on my hips, staring at the evidence like some hard-boiled detective who just cracked a case. Except this wasn't a murder. It was my water, flowing freely into Karen's paradise while my farm baked under the unrelenting sun. The sheer nerve of it, the gall to tap into my well like it was her personal luxury spa, left me teetering between fury and a dark, bitter amusement. Who even thinks they can get away with something this brazen? I wanted to storm over right then, rip out her precious fountain with my bare hands, but I held back. Rage wouldn't win this. I needed a plan, something to make her regret ever crossing me, and by the time I trudged back to my porch, I knew exactly what I'd do. That afternoon, I strolled up to Karen's front yard, her manicured lawn practically glowing under the sunlight, and rang her doorbell, keeping my face neutral as I waited. She answered after a moment, swinging the door open in a flutter of floral fabric, a glass of iced tea in her hand and a smile plastered on her face that didn't quite reach her twitchy eyes. "Oh, Jake, what a surprise, what brings you here?" she chirped, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. I leaned against the doorframe, letting my gaze drift past her to that ostentatious fountain gurgling away, and said, "Just wondered if you've noticed anything odd with the water lately. You know, the stuff that's been disappearing from my well while your yard looks like a tropical getaway." Her smile flickered just for a split second before she laughed, a shrill, nervous sound, and waved her hand like I'd told a bad joke. "Oh, don't be silly, we've just been smart about conservation, that's all." I arched an eyebrow, letting her words hang in the air as I pressed on. "Funny, because your koi fish look like they're getting spa days while my cows are staring at me like I've betrayed them." She blinked, her composure cracking as she stammered, "Jake, I really don't know what you're talking about." But I could see the gears turning behind her eyes, the panic starting to seep through. I grinned, slow and deliberate, and said, "Guess I'll have to call the authorities then. Let them figure out where my water's going." Watching her fake cheer evaporate as she licked her lips and muttered, Now, no need for that. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding." I didn't say anything, just let her squirm. She wasn't off the hook yet, not by a long shot. That night, under a sky so dark it swallowed the stars, I slipped out to where Karen's illegal pipeline snaked from my well, a wrench in my hand and a grim determination fueling every step. I found the tampered section again, the PVC pipe gleaming faintly in the moonlight, and with a few sharp twists I shut it down tight, sealing off her stolen supply like a judge slamming a gavel. No more fountain, no more koi pond, no more lush lawn soaking up what was mine. I didn't stop there. I rigged up a small security camera, its lens trained on the buried connection, a silent sentinel ready to catch her if she dared try fixing it. I wasn't just cutting her off, I was building a case she couldn't wriggle out of. By the time I finished, the night was still, and I walked back to my house with a quiet satisfaction humming in my chest, knowing the real show was about to begin. Morning broke with a scream that pierced the stillness, Karen's voice shrieking across the fence like a banshee who'd lost her throne. And I stepped onto my porch with a mug of coffee, settling in to watch the chaos unfold. She stormed outside, her hair wild and her face twisted in horror as she gaped at her dried-up fountain, the once gushing tears now silent and pathetic under the sun's harsh glare. Her sprinklers sputtered uselessly, her koi pond shrank to a muddy puddle, and her lawn was already browning at the edges. I sipped my coffee, savoring the sight of her packing frantically, shouting into her phone as she tried to summon help, her perfect little world crumbling while my farm finally had a chance to breathe. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the opening act of her reckoning. It didn't take long for her to come stomping over, her designer sandals kicking up dust as she marched up my driveway, her face flushed red and sweaty like she'd run a marathon in her rage. "Jake!" she bellowed, planting herself in front of me with her arms crossed, and I set my mug down, leaning back in my chair with a calm I knew would drive her nuts. "Morning, Karen. What's got you so worked up?" She glared at me, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "Something's wrong with my water, it's just stopped." I tilted my head, feigning surprise. Weird coincidence, seeing as I've been having water problems too," and her eyes twitched, a flicker of doubt cutting through her bluster as she snapped. "Jake, be serious, my fountain's dead, my koi fish need water, my plants are dying. What am I supposed to do?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting her stew in her own panic before I answered, "Maybe call a plumber," and she gaped at me like I'd suggested she sell her soul. "A plumber? That'll cost a fortune." I smiled just a little and shrugged. "Yeah, probably." She huffed, muttering curses under her breath as she spun on her heel and stormed off, her sandals slapping the ground like a drumbeat of defeat. I watched her go, the taste of justice sharp on my tongue, knowing this was only the beginning of her unraveling. She thought she could steal from me and walk away unscathed, but I was about to show her that messing with a farmer's lifeblood came with a cost she'd never forget. The morning after I cut off Karen's stolen water, I woke up feeling like I'd won a quiet war, the kind of victory that settles deep in your bones before the enemy even knows they've lost. I'd barely taken my first sip of coffee when her meltdown started again, her voice carrying over the fence as she raged at her dried-up fountain like it had personally insulted her. I stepped onto my porch, mug in hand, and watched as she shook her fist at the lifeless structure, her once lush lawn turning splotchy and sad under the sun's relentless heat. Her koi pond was a disaster, the fish flopping in shallow muck as she scrambled with a garden hose that refused to work, twisting knobs and tapping the spout in a futile dance. She didn't know I'd sealed her fate, and the sight of her flailing was better than any revenge I'd imagined. It wasn't long before a white van rolled up, a plumber climbing out with the sluggish gait of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. and Karen practically dragged him to her backyard, her arms waving like a windmill as she unleashed her sob story. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee as the plumber poked around, his head shaking more with every minute. He finally pointed at the ground, saying something that made Karen's shriek echo across the yard. "What do you mean there's no connection to the city water line? That's impossible." I stifled a grin as he scratched his head, clearly baffled by her meltdown over what he didn't realize was stolen water. And when she started jabbing a finger toward my property, her voice climbing higher, I knew she was about to try pinning this on me. Game on. Sure enough, she stormed over minutes later, her face a blotchy red that could have been anger or the heat. But the way she clutched her phone like a weapon told me fury was winning. "Jake, I need to talk to you right now," she snapped, crossing her arms as I set my coffee down with exaggerated slowness. "Morning, Karen, you look stressed." She sucked in a breath, barely holding it together. "Something's wrong with my water. My plumber says there's no connection to the main line, which is ridiculous, so I need you to tell me if you did something." I blinked at her, all innocence. "Me? Why would I mess with your water?" And she let out a laugh that was more snarl than humor. "Oh, come on, Jake, my water was fine yesterday. Now it's gone. What are the chances?" I shrugged, leaning back with a casual air that I knew would rattle her. "Well, with how much water you've been using, maybe you just ran out." And her mouth flapped open, words failing her as she processed the jab. "This isn't funny. My plants are dying, my fish are suffocating, my property value. Going to tank if my lawn turns brown." She sputtered, and I scratched my chin, pretending to mull it over. "Sounds rough." She glared, her voice dropping to a hiss. "Fix it." And I sighed, letting the moment stretch before I said, "Karen, hate to break it to you, but you don't have a legal connection. You've been stealing my water." Her eyes widened, but I wasn't done. Not yet, not when I could see her world cracking right in front of me. Karen's face froze as my words sank in, her eyes bulging like a cornered animal. But before she could spit out a denial, I raised a hand to cut her off, my voice steady and sharp as a blade. "I followed my pipes, Karen, found an illegal tap running straight from my well to your yard, keeping your fountain gushing and your koi fish pampered while my farm turned to dust," I said, watching her jaw tighten so hard I thought it might crack. She stammered, "That's a ridiculous accusation," but the tremble in her voice betrayed her, and I pulled out my phone, tapping the screen until the security footage glowed bright. There it was, clear as daylight, the pipe snaking from my property into hers, a silent confession she couldn't dodge. I held it up, letting her see her own guilt staring back, and said, "Doesn't matter who set it up, your land, your gain, your problem." Her face drained of color, the red flush replaced by a sickly pallor as she stared at the screen, her mouth working like a fish out of water before she forced a weak chuckle. Okay, look, let's not get dramatic. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding. We can work something out," she said, her tone shifting to a desperate plea, but I smirked, leaning back in my chair. "Oh, we're working something out, all right. I could report this. You know, illegal water theft's a big deal, fines in the thousands, maybe even jail time." Her face twitched, a flicker of fear breaking through her mask. "But you wouldn't do that, right?" "We're neighbors," she tried, her laugh shaky and hollow, and I chuckled. "Neighbors don't steal each other's livelihoods." She shifted her weight, eyes darting as she whispered, "Okay, so how much do you want?" I tilted my head, playing along. "Excuse me." And she leaned closer, voice low like we were conspirators. "How much to make this go away? I'll pay, just name your price." I pretended to think it over, letting her sweat as I tallied up the damage in my head. Weeks of lost irrigation, suffering crops, thirsty animals, the plumber's bill for nothing. And then I grinned. "Well, considering all that, plus the principal of it, let's say $5,000. Her eyes nearly popped out of her skull. "5,000? That's insane," she yelped, and I crossed my arms. "You know what's insane? Stealing water while my cows begged for a drop." She made a frustrated noise, packing in tight circles. "That's robbery." But I just shrugged. "Take it to the HOA and the authorities if you'd rather. They won't be as nice as me." She glared at me, her jaw working like she was chewing on the bitter truth, and after a long, tense silence, she huffed out a defeated, "Fine." I grinned wider, pleasure doing business, and by the end of the day, the money hit my account, her grumbling a sour soundtrack to her surrender. But I knew this wasn't the end, not yet. She thought paying me off would bury it, but the HOA caught wind the next week when she tried spinning herself as the victim. My video evidence shut that down fast, and they hit her with a fat fine for breaking regulations, piling more pain on her crumbling empire. Word spread like wildfire, and soon Karen, the self-crowned queen of the neighborhood, was the punchline of every whispered joke. Her reign was over, and I was just warming up. Karen thought her troubles ended when she forked over the cash and took the HOA's fine. But she didn't realize karma had only just rolled up its sleeves. I'd cut off her water, sure, but watching her paradise fall apart was the real payoff. Her yard, once a smug showcase of stolen wealth, started betraying her fast, without my well feeding it. The grass that had glowed an unnatural green faded to patchy brown, then yellow, then died completely, leaving her lawn a graveyard of her own making. The koi pond, her pride and joy, turned into a sludgy pit, the fancy fish she'd flaunted as status symbols flopping in despair until she had to pay someone to cart them off. Word was, that bill alone stung her ego more than her wallet. I'd catch her from my porch, coffee in hand, as she stared at her dry fountain, its tears mocking her with silence, and I'd smile, knowing every crack in her perfect world was one she'd carved herself. She tried keeping up the act, hauling in jugs of store-bought water like some desperate survivalist, dragging gallon after gallon from her car to save her wilting plants. I spotted her one evening, face red and hair plastered with sweat, lugging the bottles across her yard as the sun baked her dreams to dust. It was a losing battle. The heat was merciless, and without a steady supply, her landscaping shriveled faster than she could pour, her lawn turning into a brittle wasteland despite her efforts. She must have burned through cash and patience before giving up, because the jugs stopped appearing after a week. Then the HOA dropped the hammer. After her stunt with my well, they passed a new rule: no underground piping without permits, inspections, and fees, cutting her off from any sneaky fixes and leaving her stuck with the city's stingy rations. She was trapped, her oasis officially dead, and I couldn't have scripted it better. Karen didn't go down quietly. She called an emergency HOA meeting, spinning a tale to rally the neighbors, but it backfired hard. Everyone already knew what she'd done, and the room buzzed with stifled laughs as she flailed for sympathy. Someone even cracked a joke about a Karen tax for water cheats, and when she stormed out, red-faced and friendless, it was clear she'd lost whatever sway she once had. Her crown was shattered, and the neighborhood wasn't about to help her pick up the pieces. Soon after, a for sale sign sprouted in her yard, but the market didn't care about her delusions. With a dead lawn, no backyard charm, and an HOA rap sheet, her house was a tough sell. Buyers sniffed around, but the only ones biting were farmers like me, and she'd rather eat dirt than let one of us have it. She held out, rejecting lowball offers and swearing she'd wait for the right buyer, but time wasn't her friend. Her trashed reputation and the worsening state of her property chipped away at her leverage. The heat kept pounding, turning her yard into a dust bowl, and even her pristine front started peeling under neglect. Without my water, her whole facade collapsed, piece by crumbling piece. I watched it all, knowing she'd brought this on herself, and every dry patch of her land felt like a trophy. She'd tried to drain me dry, but in the end, she was the one left parched, her empire nothing but a memory fatting under the sun. Karen's downfall hit its peak one morning when I stepped outside and saw a moving truck hulking in her driveway, its engine rumbling like the final note of her defeat. I thought at first she sold the place, but as I watched, it clicked. She wasn't selling, she was fleeing. She darted between the house and the truck, barking at movers who hauled her overpriced furniture. Designer patio sets, gaudy lamps, all the trappings of her fake royalty, while her face twisted with a mix of frustration and shame. She didn't wave goodbye, didn't knock on doors to spin one last victim tale, just loaded up and vanished like a ghost too embarrassed to linger. I stood there letting the sight sink in, and when the truck finally growled out of sight, leaving her house a hollow shell, I exhaled a long, satisfied breath. The queen of the neighborhood had abdicated her throne, and I'd had a front-row seat to her exile. Her property sat empty after that, a monument to her collapse, the once vibrant lawn now a tangle of dirt and weeds, the backyard she'd preened over abandoned to the elements. Offers trickled in, each lower than the last, until it was clear no one wanted her tarnished dream at the price she'd imagined. Weeks passed and the house decayed further, the heat bleaching what little dignity it had left, until finally someone scooped it up for a fraction of its old value. And that someone was me, signing the papers with a grin that felt like the final twist of the knife. It wasn't even about revenge anymore. It was principle. Karen had spent months trying to bleed my farm dry, acting like she was above me, and now I owned the very ground she'd stood on, her precious oasis turned to rubble under my name. I walked into what used to be her pristine backyard, staring at the dried-up mess she'd left. The fountain gone, the koi pond a crater, the lawn a dusty scar, and felt a quiet triumph. She'd stolen from me, but I'd taken back everything, plus interest, and the irony was sweeter than any water she'd ever siphoned. I turned on the hose, letting it run free over the cracked earth, watching it soak in where it belonged, and knew this was the end of our war. She was gone, and I was still standing, stronger than ever. The neighborhood buzzed for a while after she left, folks swapping stories about her water heist like it was local legend. Some laughed outright when they passed her old place, others just shook their heads at how far she'd fallen. I didn't care much for the gossip. My crops were greening up again, my cattle drinking deep from full troughs, my farm humming with life now that the thief was out of the picture. Karen's reign had cost her thousands, her reputation, and her home, while I'd turned her greed into my gain. She wanted to play high and mighty, draining my well for her vanity, but in the end she drained herself, her wallet, her pride, her place in the world, all while I watched her empire crumble from my porch, coffee in hand. Looking back, it was almost funny how she'd thought she could outsmart me, a farmer who'd spent years coaxing life from stubborn soil. She'd underestimated the quiet stubbornness of someone who knows what's theirs and fights to keep it. I'd won, not with noise or fury, but with patience and proof, letting her own actions bury her. Karen was a memory now, a cautionary tale, and as I stood on her old land, I felt the weight of victory settle in. The water was mine again, and so was the last laugh. Owning Karen's old place felt like planting a flag on conquered ground, a quiet claim to everything she'd tried to take from me. I didn't rush to fix it up, didn't bother polishing her faded paradise. I let it sit for a while, the dust and weeds a testament to her collapse. My farm was my focus, and with the water flowing where it belonged, the fields stretched green again, the irrigation ditches humming with life, and my cattle grazing contentedly under a sky that no longer felt like an enemy. Karen's greed had cost me weeks of struggle, but it had cost her everything, and that balance tipped the scales back in my favor. I'd stroll over to her old yard sometimes, kicking at the dry earth where her fountain once stood, and think about how she'd strutted around like she owned the world. Now I owned her world, and the thought brought a grin I couldn't shake. The neighborhood settled into a new rhythm without her, the whispers about her water theft fading into chuckles, her name a punchline no one bothered defending. I didn't turn her place into some grand statement. Didn't need to. The victory was in the deed, not the decor, so I started small, running a hose from my well to wet the ground, watching it drink deep for the first time without her siphoning it away. Eventually, I'd expand my fields there, maybe put up a shed or let the livestock roam. Nothing fancy, just practical, the way a farmer builds something lasting out of someone else's ruin. The HOA kept their new rules tight, a legacy of Karen's mess, and every time I saw a neighbor double-check their pipes, I'd smirk. Her downfall had rewritten the rule book, and I'd been the one to hand them the pen. Her house, once a gaudy shrine to her ego, became mine to reshape, and I took my time, letting the land tell me what it needed instead of forcing it into her shallow mold. The best part wasn't the land or the money she'd paid. It was knowing she'd never come back, that the woman who'd sneered at my barn and cursed my rooster had run off with her tail between her legs, chased out by her own arrogance. I heard through the grapevine she'd moved to some city apartment, probably griping about the noise and the neighbors, stuck in a concrete box with no lawn to obsess over. Her kingdom of koi and fountains was a distant dream now, and I'd bet she thought of me every time she turned on a tap, wondering how it all went so wrong. Meanwhile, I'd sit on my porch, coffee warming my hands, and watch the sun rise over a farm that was whole again, her old place just another patch of my world, reclaimed and repurposed without a trace of her left to haunt it. In the end, Karen's war on my water had been her undoing. She'd picked a fight with someone who didn't bend, didn't break, and didn't forget, and I'd let her dig her own grave with every gallon she stole. The water flowed free now, my crops thrived, my animals flourished, and her empty house stood as a quiet trophy. I didn't need to shout about winning. The proof was in the dirt, the green, the life she'd tried to choke out and failed. She wanted to drain me dry, but I'd turned her scheme into my strength, and as I looked out over it all, I knew the war was over. Karen was gone, the water was mine, and the last laugh echoed across the fields, loud and clear.